Hello, this is Roy Silva. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the San Clemente, California stake. And today we are continuing our weekly Come Follow Me discussions following the lesson outline, more or less. And today is the lesson for the week of March 20th through 26th. It's actually the 25th, so I'm cutting it a little bit close, but I figure better late than never. And the assignment is Matthew chapter 13, which is the main body of the assignment. It has a few parables in it. And then there's also some material drawn from Luke chapter 8 and Luke chapter 13. And we'll look at those parallel accounts, but really the lesson manual only draws a few verses from the Luke part of the lesson that mirror what's in the Matthew part. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty like I usually do. As you know, I like talking about Christ's interactions with other people. And I love that because we get to see him uh, listening and interacting, having conversations, addressing people's problems. And we get a window into his character that I think is like no other opportunity we get in the scriptures. And I love that. And that's not strictly within the boundaries of today's lesson, but it is within some of the chapters in Luke. So we are going to start there. And the first thing I'd like to cover is in Luke chapter 13. There's an account of Jesus going into the synagogues, and apparently this was just every Sabbath. Of course, he went to the synagogues, but he used that opportunity to teach whenever he was allowed by the rulers of the synagogue. And we read in Luke chapter 13, verse 11. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years. I'm not exactly sure what that means, why it's being described as an inner, maybe a psychological, a spirit of infirmity, and was bowed together and could in no wise lift herself up. So she walked extremely hunched over and just wasn't able to stand up straight. The gospel writer calls it a spirit of infirmity, but we have no idea if it was partly psychological or some problem with her back, her spine perhaps. But anyway, she had it for 18 years. So obviously a very long time for an affliction such as this. Now, before we proceed, the reason I'm leading with this is because in last week's lesson, we talked about a very similar situation in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. And as you recall, that's the man with the withered hand. And the Pharisees were there watching Jesus. We talked about how before doing the healing, he had the man stand up in front of them, kind of to draw their attention that, hey, this is not an abstraction. This is a human being. Look at his face. He is a person with emotions and with many of the same struggles that we all have, but on top of that, this affliction. He tried to humanize the man. He tried to get the Pharisees' attention, and they just would not cooperate. They were fixated on whether he was going to, quote, break, unquote, the Sabbath day according to their traditions. And so we have the parallel situation here in Luke. He goes to the synagogue, and there is a woman who's hunched over in an extreme, it must have been painful way that obviously limited a lot of her basic life activities. And so we have these two different people coming into the synagogue on two different Sabbaths. And the irony of of both situations is in the first, with the man with the withered hand, we have the Pharisees uh, looking to accuse him, and uh, they're determined that if he does something that they consider work, then they are going to accuse him of violating the Sabbath day. And in the account we're about to read of the woman with the woman that was bowed over, we see that the ruler of the synagogue is the one who verbalizes how this healing is a violation of the Sabbath. Now, let's pause there. The irony is tremendous. It's almost overwhelming, right? Because you have Jehovah, the one who gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, standing there in the flesh, and he is performing miracles, and yet you have him being opposed by people who pretend to know the law and to worship him, Jehovah, who they're not recognizing now, but their concept of Jehovah, they pretend to be his servants, and they are accusing Jehovah of breaking his own law and not following, not understanding, not respecting his own law. It's too much, right? It's just so rich, and you can't help but wish that maybe we'll get this opportunity to see those people stand before him to be judged in the future, and have the awareness dawn on them, if it hasn't already in the spirit world, that this person who they accused and rejected of not respecting what Jehovah had commanded was himself Jehovah in the flesh in front of them. So that's the situation, right? So let's go to this account of the woman, and it says, "And when Jesus saw her, he called her unto him." Now that's interesting because men and women sat segregated in the synagogues, and I'm not sure if at this period there was a screen or some kind of physical division, but I believe that women were made to sit behind the congregation of men, whether or not behind a screen. But Jesus sees her and calls her to him and says unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And this is interesting. He doesn't just say the healing words as he so often has, but he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight. For the first time in 18 years, she was able to stand straight. And you can just imagine the tears of relief and joy running down her face. And we read, and she glorified God. Now, let's just once again pause there before we finish with the story. And think to ourselves how she must have felt that morning, right? 18 years she has had this terrible affliction, and yet here she is at church, what we would call church, right? Worshiping the Lord. And she, I'm sure this wasn't because it was, she did it once a year, right? I believe that if she's there on an ordinary Sabbath, 18 years into this affliction, I mean, how many Sabbaths is that? 52 times 18, right? It's close to 1,000 times she has gotten up in the morning and has put on her best clothes and made the painful trip to the synagogue with this infirmity, certainly helped by others. And we can say the same thing of the man with the withered hand. He was where he was supposed to be, keeping the Sabbath day, worshiping the Lord. Now, I think that there is a parallel here. right? How many times do we think to ourselves on a Sunday morning? I know, I do. Once in a while, I think, gosh, I don't want to go to church today. For whatever reason, like I I don't feel like putting on my happy face and smiling and being around all these people who seem to be like, happy and successful and I feel inferior to them. They're better than I am in some way, because we all compare ourselves to others. And or maybe we feel like I'm different. I don't feel like going to church. Wouldn't this woman with this terrible affliction, wouldn't the man with the shriveled, unsightly paralysis in his hand, would they not have felt justified in thinking, gosh, I don't I don't want to go be around people and be reminded that I'm not normal. Or even worse, I don't want people looking at me. I don't want them thinking, look at that freak. I don't want to be judged, right? It is hard for us sometimes to go to church. And yet we have these examples of two people suffering, people who had every reason to feel different and separated and maybe even singled out by God for suffering. Yet there they were in his house worshiping him on a Sunday. And what would have happened if they had chosen not to go on that Sunday when the Savior happened to show up at their synagogue, and they went home that day healed? They woke up that morning with no idea that they would ever be made whole. It seemed just like any other of the thousands and thousands of days of suffering that they had had leading up to then. But they made a choice. They made a decision. I am going to worship the Lord. I am going to keep his commandments. And having no clue, no inkling of what was waiting for them there. And when they went to sleep that night, they were whole, something they could never have dreamed, never have imagined, right? It's the way the Lord's miracles so often work. And it happened because of the way they chose to exercise their agency. If they had not been there, it could not have happened. Jesus would not have seen the woman and 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 had compassion on her and felt moved to heal her. And same with the man with the withered hand, right? So I think that we can probably, those of us who have gone to church uh, any with any consistency, we can share maybe smaller shadows of that kind of experience where we go to church and someone says something during a lesson or a talk, or we see someone who maybe comes up and says something kind to us, and we are healed. Something that we have carried with us. Maybe it's something small. It's not an outward disability that we've had for years and years, but it may be an internal uh, wound or burden. And we have that lifted in a way we could not have anticipated. And how often is that the case in our lives, right? I mean, I'll share with you an experience. I a couple of weeks ago, so I teach gospel doctrine in my ward. My ward was just recently divided, and so I got called to teach, and I got a call from one of the counselors in the bishopric who said, "Hey, can you show up at such and such a time to get set apart?" And I in my mind, of course, I said yes, but in my mind, I'm kind of like, really? Like, church isn't until the afternoon. And now in the middle of the morning, I'm going to have to like get my suit on and drive to the building and drive back. It's, Can we just do it during the block, right? I admit I was in a complaining Laman and Lemuel kind of mood, right? But I go and I meet him, I smile, he takes me to a room. I barely know the guy. I don't think I've exchanged two sentences with him ever before, even though the previous version of the ward, we our neighborhoods were still part of that ward. Uh, but when he was called to be in the bishopric, I didn't even know who he was, and he certainly doesn't know me yet. We went into an empty room and he laid his hands on my head and gave me a setting apart blessing. And during that blessing, he said two things that I had not expected. And and they were precisely the two things that have been the biggest challenge I've been struggling with over the last few weeks and months. He couldn't have known that. But because I was there, the Lord was able, through him, to address those for me. And so when I drove home from the building, it could not have been a bigger contrast to my grumbling mood when I went. And so, brothers and sisters, I think that there is a reason why these accounts are in the scriptures, right? I've tried and will continue trying to extract uh, larger lessons from every interaction that Jesus has with people, larger lessons that teach us who he is and how he treats people, especially the people who come to him for help. And and I don't think that any of these accounts, the accounts of the guy that was possessed with the legion of unclean spirits in the tombs, or the guy lying by the pool of Bethesda, or you name an interaction or a miracle in the Gospels. And 9 out of 10 times, if we ponder and pray, the Holy Ghost shows us some universal application in that lesson. And so I don't want us this year, as we go through the Gospels, to just think, okay, well, these stories are here because they are testaments to Jesus' divinity, that he could work miracles. But it was all stuff that happened 2,000 years ago. I don't have a withered hand. I don't have a legion of unclean spirits living in me, and I'm not running around the mountains and the tombs. Uh, I'm not fill in the blank, any of these things. But in each instance, there are either symbolically or actually there are parallels in the circumstance to us and our lives today. And so it is with this account of the woman with the infirmity, the man with the withered hand. The lesson being that because they chose to worship the Lord and be where they were supposed to be on the Sabbath day, a miracle they could never have anticipated happened to them. And that is true of just about everything we talk about. So I hope that we approach the Gospels with that spirit and with that expectation. So let's just finish this account in Luke chapter 13. So we just read verse 13, and Jesus laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. Boy, would I have liked to see that beautiful overflow of joy and relief and praise that must have come from her. And the ruler of the synagogue, answering with indignation, he's furious. Here's someone comes into my synagogue on the Sabbath day and right under my nose breaks the Sabbath, right? But he doesn't address Jesus. No, he doesn't have the courage to turn to Jesus and accuse him. This guy has powers and has just worked this amazing miracle. But, here's the thing. The guy's heart is so hard that instead of being astonished, instead of pondering, instead of trying to understand that maybe his conception of the Sabbath may need to be adjusted, right? Instead of being humbled by the miracle he has just seen, he's angry. And he says unto the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them, therefore, come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. Don't come into my synagogue on Sunday and expect to break the Sabbath right here under my jurisdiction, right? And so he doesn't address that to Jesus, but he means for Jesus to hear it, doesn't he? And Jesus answers him, and I love this. He does not mince words. Jesus is so direct. Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath lose his ox or his ass from the stall? Untie your animals so that they can drink and eat. So he, as with the Pharisees in the synagogue with the man with the withered hand, he tries to break through their prejudices with just simple, ordinary, common sense about an example from daily life, right? And then he draws the comparison. And not this woman being a daughter of Abraham? He says to the Pharisees in the previous example, is not a man better than a sheep who falls into a hole that you would pull out? He says here, ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, one of the covenant people, whom Satan hath bound, interesting, right? Lo, these 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? So, teaching through a question, right? Does the ruler of the synagogue, is he able to oppose that reasoning or that example? He's silenced. And when Jesus had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, right? So it wasn't just the ruler of the synagogue. There must have been others of the emissaries, the spies of the Pharisees following him around, watching everything he did. And they were all ashamed. And all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. So I wanted to start out with that. And then before going to the parables, we're going to talk about one other thing that is within Luke chapter 8, even though it's a little bit outside the narrow slice of verses that is designated in the lesson. And this is an incident that happened. It's also covered by chapters in the other Gospels that we've read earlier, but we didn't talk about it, so we're going to talk about it now. Okay, so this is and this is why I call this lesson "Master, the Tempest is Raging." It's the stilling of the storm. So in Luke chapter 8, verse 22, now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples, and he said unto them, let us go over into the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake. And Joseph Smith, this is verse 23 of Luke chapter 8. You see that little italicized 8. Joseph Smith altered the text a little bit. And they were feared with fear and were in danger. So let's just pause there a minute. They were filled with fear. But these were men who, some of them, right? Peter, Andrew, James, John, they made their living on that very lake, on the water. They had, since they were children, been out on the water in all kinds of weather, right? They had been in, this wasn't their first rodeo, it wasn't their first storm, but this one was so bad that they were terrified. And they came unto him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. Now, I like the Mark version because, as we've said before, Mark has the fewest It's the shortest gospel. He has the fewest incidents in the gospel that he wrote, but he has details that are in none of the other gospels. So Mark tells us where Jesus was in the ship. He was in the bow. He was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. I doubt it was the type of pillow we have today. It might have been a burlap bag with some straw in it. Who knows? But he was sleeping, and throughout all the commotion and the tossing and the spray of water that must have been beating on his face and getting him wet, he slept through it all. He was exhausted. And they came unto him. And the question here, in Luke, it's just that they say, Master, we perish. Here, it's a rude question. Master, carest thou not that we perish? Like, you're being negligent, right? You're why aren't you attending to us, right? Don't you see that we are in trouble, that we're in danger? So that's the additional detail from Mark. And in both Mark and Luke, he arose, he rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he turns to them and says unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? Well, what did he mean by that? The answer to that is, I think, in the hymn, Master, the Tempest is Raging. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the answer in that hymn is no water can swallow the ship where lies the master of uh, ocean and earth and skies. So I think what he was telling them is, do you really think that we could all drown while the Messiah, Jehovah, lies in the same ship as you? Uh, and uh, and if you look in the Luke account, this is the only exclamation mark I know of, or maybe the only one I've ever noticed in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 8:25, and they being afraid wondered, saying one to another, What manner of man is this? Exclamation mark. For he commandeth even the winds and water, and they obey him. So we've been talking about how almost all the instances that are recorded in the Gospels have some larger application. And of course, this is no exception. And it's not easy, right, to see the parallels. And so, what I'd like to do is share with you a talk that Elder Howard W. Hunter gave in 1984 in General Conference. And he starts by setting the scene. He says, north of Jerusalem, about 80 miles or so, lies a beautiful body of water known earlier in biblical times as the Sea of Chinnereth and the Lake of Gennesaret, but known best to us today as the Sea of Galilee. It is a freshwater inland lake a little over 12 miles long and 7 miles wide. The River Jordan flows through it from north to south. This was the lake Jesus knew as a child and as a young man. Its western shores lying just 12 or 15 miles from his boyhood home in Nazareth. It was to this lake and the neighboring Galilean hills that Jesus returned so often during those demanding years of public ministry. So he talks about the what led up to the incident we've just read. He says the Sea of Galilee is quite low, about 680 feet below sea level, and the heat becomes great. The hills surrounding the water rise up very sharply and to considerable height. The cold air rushing down from the hills meets the warm air rising from the lake in such a way that sudden and temporarily violent storms can occur on the surface of that inland sea. So he then quotes the Mark account, and he draws parallels, right? He says, all of us have seen some sudden storms in our lives. A few of them, though temporarily like these on the Sea of Galilee, can be violent and frightening and potentially destructive. Okay. And we may have experienced them, he says, and they may even have made us ask one way or another, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And one way or another, we always hear in the stillness after the storm, why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? This great Jehovah, in whom we say we trust, and whose name we have taken upon us, is he who said, and then Elder Hunter talks about the creation, that he created the elements, that he created every body of water. And so Elder Hunter, I'm going to take his talk a little bit out of order, and say that Jesus has told us, in the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And he says Jesus was not spared grief and pain and anguish and buffeting. No tongue can speak the unutterable burden he carried, nor have we the wisdom to understand the prophet Isaiah's description of him as a man of sorrows. His ship was tossed most of his life, and at least to mortal eyes, it crashed fatally on the rocky coast of Calvary. We are asked not to look on life with mortal eyes. With spiritual vision, we know something quite different was happening upon the cross. Peace was on the lips and in the heart of the Savior, no matter how fiercely the tempest was raging. So that's one parallel that Elder Hunter, later President Hunter, draws from this outward physical experience. But then he gives a beautiful example of the inner experience that sooner or later comes to each of us. And he uses as his example the author of the hymn, Master, the Tempest is Raging. And her name is Mary Ann Baker. She wrote the words. She just had one brother, and he suffered from the same respiratory disease that had killed her parents. She and he lived in Chicago, and in those days, the only treatment available for some types of respiratory illness was the warmer, a gentler, moist climate of the tropics. And so he left to go to the southern part of the United States. I think it was Florida. And for a time, he seemed to be improving, but then a sudden turn in his health came and he died almost immediately. Mary Ann Baker and her sister were heartbroken. Is this ringing a bell to you? Can you think of another person who died, who lived with his two sisters and who died? Lazarus, right? So she and her sister were heartbroken, and it only added to their deep grief that neither their own health nor their personal finances allowed them to claim their brother's body or to finance its return to Chicago for burial. Now, the Baker family had been raised as faithful Christians, but Mary's trust in a loving God broke under the strain of her brother's death and her own diminished circumstances. God does not care for me or mine, said Mary Ann. This particular manifestation of what they call divine providence is unworthy of a God of love. Does that at all sound familiar? Elder Hunter asks us. And then she goes on and says, I I have always tried to believe on Christ and give the Master a consecrated life, but this is more than I can bear. What have I done to deserve this? What have I left undone that God should wreak his vengeance upon me in this way? And that's where Elder Hunter says, all of us sooner or later are likely to have a similar experience where we feel these emotions and say, uh, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And so cried Mary Ann Baker. But as the days and the weeks went by, the God of life and love began to calm the winds and the waves of what the sweet young woman called her unsanctified heart. Her faith not only returned, but it flourished, and like Job of old, she learned new things, things too wonderful to have known before her despair. On the Sea of Galilee, the stirring of the disciples' faith was ultimately more important than the stilling of the sea, and so it was with her. Later, as something of a personal testimonial and caring very much for the faith of others who would be tried by personal despair, she wrote the words of the hymn we have all sung, Master, the Tempest is Raging. And we all know the words to that, but I don't know if we focused very much on the second verse where she expressly draws the parallel between the outward winds and the waves and the internal storm. Master, with anguish of spirit, I bow in my grief today. The depths of my sad heart are troubled. Oh, awaken and save me, I pray. Torrents of sin and of anguish sweep o'er my sinking soul, and I perish, dear Master. Oh, hasten and take control. So I think that knowing the background to that hymn, which is the musical expression of this gospel event, uh, is something beautiful and something that deepens our uh, our understanding next time we sing that hymn. Of course, uh, Handel, Bach, many great composers have also set this incident to music. But I, I think that for uh, simplicity and for uh, heartfelt expression coming from someone's personal experience, that the hymn that we love is it can't be beaten, right? And just for the record, my favorite version of that on YouTube is the Dallas Adult Christian Choir's version. All right, so now we're going to turn to the remainder of the lesson, which has to do with the parables.